Hello and welcome to another Hastings County Historical Society presentation on Zoom. My name is Jerry Freyberg. I'm the Vice President of the Association. Today we welcome Bill Fox, Archaeologist Bill Fox, who will be talking about Indigenous history, reading between and beyond the lines.
To begin, I'd like to say that I trust that the following will acknowledge the millennia of complex history relating to the Indigenous occupation of Southern Ontario. So this afternoon, as advertised, I will present a traditional chronological review of archaeology related to the millennia of Indigenous occupation across Southern Ontario. Please understand that each slide merely summarizes information which, to do it justice, would require hours and days of discussion. I will link this summary to the limited but important evidence from Hastings County and immediate vicinity. We will then turn our attention to assessing the earliest European historical references to the region and what they document concerning a local, very influential merchant. So let's begin at the beginning. Well, it's certainly the post-glacial beginning of human occupation in our province. So as the Continental Glacier retreated and the landscape rebounded, there were a series of relatively short-term Great Lake configurations. Lake Iroquois existed from about 13,000 years ago when Belleville was underwater. Saltwater, the Champlains Sea from 1207 to about 1104 years ago extended almost as far west as Belleville and was home to whales and other marine mammals. It was at this time that we have evidence for the presence of pioneering Indigenous bands. These small hunting bands appear to have focused on caribou, but also harvested other species of animals such as Arctic fox and Arctic hare, based on fossil remains from a Fluted Point site in Southern Ontario. And no doubt they were collecting plant foods. So these groups produce distinctive lance heads known as Fluted Points. And you'll see from left to right a series of different style points, which generally speaking run from earliest to the left to latest to the right. So the interesting thing is that the material that these points are made from is found in very specific locations. The Flint nappers are the producers of these toolkits by these earliest pioneering groups. Their nappers were very selective as to what kind of chert or flint they would use, and so they actually went to outcrops of the material to acquire their toolstone. So in the bottom below the Fluted Points, you'll see a series of different types of chert that they accessed. Bayport over in Michigan by Saginaw Bay, Collingwood chert from up in the Beaver Valley, Onondaga chert from down in the Niagara Escarpment area, and those are sort of the primary sources that were being utilized. And we've got evidence of their migrating, following caribou herds, probably between the winter range down near Park Hill up to a summer range near Collingwood on a seasonal basis, back and forth. So that's basically the import of it. There's a little image to the right that is of a Fluted Point from Prince Edward County, as you can see, and it relates most closely to what's known as a Crowfield Point, which is item E in the top illustration. And so it's a relatively late form of Fluted Point in the sequence, but again, it's extremely ancient. The next slide shows you examples of Fluted Points on the left from the vicinity of Belleville. The one on the left is from the Napanee area, and the one in the center is a gorgeous crystal quartz Fluted Point. Was recovered near Newcastle. Interesting thing is that it has remains of red ochre paint on it, which suggests that it was not only a beautifully made Fluted Point, but probably pretty significant ritually also. And I just threw in the 2 points to the right because they provide some BP ages for the Fluted Point at the top, but for the little triangular point at the bottom. And you'll see at the bottom that it's at around 18,000 years ago. And we just don't find them in Ontario. And there's a good reason for that, because at that time, Ontario was covered by a sheet of ice. So there are Indigenous groups living south of the Continental Glacier at this time. And I just want to emphasize that they are moving northward as the ice retreats. The other one other thing I wish to mention was that did anyone notice a recent announcement of a 23,000-year-old footprint or series of footprints in New Mexico? And I would just want to point out that this is not the only evidence for pre-last glacial maximum colonization in the Americas by Indigenous groups, and it won't be the last. It's that's the importance of it. There are many sites of that nature. So in this slide here, I'm showing you a lance head from the vicinity of Maynooth in Hastings County. It dates to around 9,300 years ago. And it may be evidence for the final years of caribou-focused hunting activity in the region, but it has a more important story to tell. And take a look at its form, the fact that it's basically lancelet, it has little corner notches near the base, and it also has a controlled flaking pattern that's kind of parallel oblique in nature, very similar to the lancelet point immediately to the right. So the notches are like the biface to the far right, the flaking's like the that on the center piece. So two different styles of projectile point. So as the environment conducive to large caribou migrations moved northward in Ontario, Western peoples moved across the Canadian Shield eastward through Ontario to southern Quebec and as far as present-day New Brunswick. They met resident populations in southern Ontario descended from the Fluted Point bands and who had connections to the south. So here you see some other examples of these angled corner notch bifaces from all over places up towards South Shore of Georgian Bay. There's the Maynooth fine spot. There's another one in the Ottawa Valley and some in the Chagwinda site up in Manitoulin. So this interface between two different cultural groups who have different stylistic traditions is represented by these biface lance heads and knives. So these Southern Ontario so-called early archaic groups participated in a much different stylistic tradition, as you can see from this slide. And it connected them with populations throughout Eastern North America. One of the interesting things is why we find these style of dart heads. A lot of these are points from darts that would have looked like a large arrow with some fletching, but they were thrown with an atlatl or throwing stick. So that was probably the dominant hunting technology at the time and went on for thousands of years. So question became, how come these look almost identical to specimens in West Virginia or Georgia? And that raises some very interesting questions about long distance communication, certainly. So anyway, so this wide geographic tradition of stylistic homogeneity continued until roughly 4,500 years ago. However, there were major technical innovations occurring during this long period. So you can see these styles here. I was working down in Tennessee and found a whole drawer of bifaces similar to the third one from the left. There must have been 30 or 40 of them, all look the same in the drawer, and it's radiocarbon dated to 5,000 years ago, which is basically what they date to in Southern Ontario. So the new technology consisted of the production of stone tools through grinding, as you can see on the left there, adzes and gouges. And of course, an entirely new material began to be worked, which is native copper from roughly 9,000 years ago in the Great Lakes region. And so it's essentially temporally identical to the initial working of copper in the Old World in Eurasia, interestingly. So as illustrated in the 16th century engraving of indigenous activities along the Atlantic seaboard, dugout canoes were adzed into shape with the aid of fire. By 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, white pine forests containing trees of suitable size for dugout canoe construction were well established in Hastings County. Throughout the 5 millennium period, the population of southeastern Ontario was limited, with small, highly mobile, multifamily bands occupying traditional territories, likely defined by river drainage and lake systems. Their seasonal subsistence round would likely have mirrored that recorded in local Anishinaabe oral histories. So you could pretty well see this kind of a campsite back from many, many millennia in the Shield area of southeastern Ontario. So as the landscape became more populated or filled in, evidence of long distance connections dwindles, and certain bands in the richer Carolinian biotic province of southwestern Ontario evidence less mobility and greater population density. Again, we've got a series of early to the left to late to the right forms. And these little ones here, these Crawford Knoll or small points, are possibly represent the initiation of bow and arrow technology in the Northeast. And the groups in southwestern Ontario that are related to this technology are also related to very similar groups in places like Indiana to the south. So we're getting connections. There may actually be population movement. Interestingly, if you look just to the left, these big broad points here look like Christmas trees. They're not putting them at the end of arrows, that's for sure. And they're being used as knives or refitted into drills, and probably are lance heads when they're used as projectiles, which suggests that there may be a whole different type of deer hunting going on that drives into corral structures by Indigenous communities. And the interesting thing is this style of biface and the lifestyle connected with it initially occurs in the Savannah River Valley in Georgia and works its way up the Atlantic seaboard, swinging through New York State and into Ontario. So it's there's definitely ideas traveling, if not people. So this was a rather stunning discovery made not that long ago along the Asable drainage to the latter portion of the time period. It's the Davidson site. It's a Broad Point tradition site, and it's also a subsequent small point tradition site. So you'll see that radiocarbon dates at the bottom, the Broad Points running in between 2500 and say 2300 BC. Then followed by occupation of the small point archaic anywhere from about 1100 to 1400 BC. And the thing that was shocking about this to all concerned was the fact that we're looking at semi-subterranean lodges. I mean, these are not a series of easily transported poles and bark covering. There's a lot of work goes into the construction of these. You can see an archaeological record of one of them in the bottom left. You can see what they look like in plan views. You're going down to excavate them. You're also seeing in the top center what they look like in the interior BC area, shoe swap communities and formerly. And there you can see an artist's conception to the top right, and also an architectural drawing to the bottom right. So yeah, this came, when we'd always been thinking of bark lodges, this came as a big shock when these structures started to appear in the archaeological record. So with the higher population densities, they may have encouraged more intensive plant harvesting. So we see the initiation of plant domestication at this late archaic time period particularly with regards to a plant called Chenopodium or goosefoot. So, but there's all these other types of plants that were purposely being tended and harvested. So around 4,000 years ago, there is an increasing elaboration mortuary ritual. And by 3,000 years ago, the ritual includes ornamental marine shell, ground, stone, and copper forms, as you see on this page here. And the use of red paint and graves. The glacial cane complex is particularly strong in southeastern Ontario, Prince Edward County, and down the St. Lawrence Valley. So you see so-called birdstones here, beautifully produced from banded argillite, marine shell, so-called sandal sole gorget in the top right, marine shell disc necklace beads, native copper beads, and a huge native copper harpoon from just east of Belleville. So immediately following this, we see the arrival of the first ceramic vessels associated with the Meadowwood complex. You see an almost complete specimen from the Ottawa Valley to the right. And the Meadowwood complex continues elaborate mortuary ritual. And residue from these vessels indicates that many were used to prepare fish stews. Meadowwood also includes a major flint or Onondaga chert blade industry, with thousands of these blades manufactured in the lower Grand River region and being exported to groups as far away as Michigan, Ohio, upstate New York, and even New Brunswick. So these are the classic blades, these Onondaga chert bifaces to the far left. They've been found in numbers in the thousands in certain archaeological sites in upstate New York, for instance. This is another one of those birdstones, but characteristic stylistically of this later period is the Popeye so-called protrusions on these beautifully manufactured pieces. They're probably components of atlatls, and we don't absolutely know, but that's what they look to be. So it's at this time that exotic crops begin to arrive and be incorporated into local diets, squash and somewhat later maize or corn. And that was a crop, of course, that was initially domesticated in Mexico many thousands of years ago. And at some time over these many millennia, a brilliant indigenous technology was born, birchbark canoes. They were lighter and easier to transport and probably more stable than wooden dugouts. And the concept may have evolved from the Paleo-American hide-covered frame craft. We know that these earliest people had boats, and there really wasn't much else you could make a boat out of than a hide-covered wooden frame. So once birch trees of a suitable size were available as the forest cover advanced, then they could begin to cover their craft with the bark. It's quite possible that long distance exchange of goods and concept was promoted by the spring and summer Macroban gatherings at productive fishing sites. These must have been important events where exogamous patrilocal family bands could assemble for social interaction. And this interaction would probably based on historical references of similar groups. You'd have religious ceremonies, obviously. You'd have probably competitions. You'd have marriages. So it was an important time for different bands who were basically required connections with other bands to enhance marriages. In other words, so the males of a band could only marry outside the band, so they'd have to meet women from other bands in order to establish a family. So such activities are abundantly evidenced during the following centuries at Middlesex complex sites located strategically along the water highways of the Canadian Shield. So there's a map showing a whole series of those kind of sites around 2,400 years ago. This is kind of a sad tale for Ontario's domestic industry 2,400 years ago. Okay, at this time, Ontario's flint blade industry, that's the Meadowwood, was eclipsed by the Flint Ridge Robbins blade industry of central Ohio. This technically organized and large-scale industry manufactured tens of thousands of the larger, more colorful blades and shipped them in quantity great distances to the east and as far north as Killarney on the Huron North Shore, where a cache of nearly 50 specimens has been discovered. So they weren't fooling in terms of manufacturing, and kind of blew our local industry out of the water. An archaeologist friend and I sent a little message about this, a little note about this to the Globe and Mail back when free trade was being negotiated with the US, just as a cautionary note. I don't think it was considered very seriously. So a little over 2,000 years ago, Southern Ontario sites of ritual activity, often with mortuary components, contained items brought from considerable distances as evidenced by raw materials. So here you see a map of different kinds of chert or flint and quartzites that were being imported into Ontario, Southern Ontario and the southern portion of Northern Ontario. So you can see material is traveling some considerable distance. And these are some exotic status goods of North Dakota flint. A biface blade almost the size of my hand from Tremont Island on the left, and an even larger specimen from the mouth of the Kaministiquia River in Thunder Bay. And the interesting thing, you'll see there's a piece missing from the right specimen there. It's got to be, I don't know, it's over 30 centimeters long. It's a big blade. And I remember when I was first transferred to work for the provincial government in Thunder Bay, I saw the base of this blade in the Lakehead University collections and just went, wow, that must have been quite the biface. And funny thing is, the guy who took over from me in Thunder Bay, Bill Ross, about 20 years ago, had a gentleman approach him and said that he had something his mother had found. She was in Florida at the time, and she gave him that to take to Thunder Bay and talk to the archaeologist there. Well, Bill looked at it and he thought, geez, that looks familiar. So he took it down to the university and pulled the other piece, the base, out and went click, and they fit together, even though they were found about a kilometer apart in the delta of the Kaministiquia River. A wonderful fluke, let's say. So in terms of this time period, the exotic material, there's a Ohio pipestone tube pipe, one of the earliest forms of smoking pipe, again dating to a little over 2,000 years ago, and certainly traveling some considerable distance to the north shore of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. So following directly on is the Hopewell complex of Ohio in the Midwest about 2,000 years ago, plus or minus a few centuries. And the exotic goods were imported from even greater distances for ritual activities. So here you get a general sense. You can see the Knife River, chert or flint, but also the obsidian, which was coming in considerable quantity from Wyoming, maybe Idaho, into central Ohio. So this is some of the metal work that these artisans in central Ohio on these Hopewell sites were producing, and see raw native copper and a wonderful parrot effigy produced out of copper. And that copper, for the most part, was being mined in the Lake Superior region and transported to central Ohio. There's also native silver. You can see a chunk in the bottom right, of course, and some disc ear spools above it that were manufactured by these craftsmen. Interesting thing is that we knew that there was a limited amount of native silver being worked and transported as far away as the current state of Mississippi from Ohio. But I'd always assumed, since there's native silver associated with the copper in the Keweenaw and Southern Lake Superior, that that's where they were getting their silver from. But a friend of mine, Dr. Michael Spence at Western University, ran some geochemical tests on the silver, and to my surprise, for sure, it was coming from cobalt. And you got to wonder, wow, like that's certainly we know Indigenous communities are well aware of the resources in their abandoned regions or areas, but for them to start pulling the silver out and transporting it is another issue. So this is pretty exciting. And as I say, for me, it was a bit shocking. Wasn't what I expected. So the skill of the Hopewell artisans is unrivaled in the history of the Indigenous Northeast. And these are examples of some stone effigy pipes. They're just quite spectacular. They also produced ceramics that look like this, that just almost never get found in Ontario. They're not transported any distance, not being used by other groups. So, you know, some of their sites, this is just one example called the Mounds City on the Scioto River. There's a historic map of it, top left, and you can see an artist's conception of it to the right. These were no small undertakings architecturally, a lot of earth moving for sure. And the interesting thing about it also is that you're getting astronomical alignments in the placement of mounds and sites, et cetera, et cetera. So this was just no random location of structures. So it's a very sophisticated society. Obviously, in our area, another thing that would have supported Macroban gatherings was wild rice. Interestingly, at this time, circular burial mounds were being constructed, but a unique form of mound is found at Rice Lake, the so-called serpent mound, perhaps modeled after the Ohio mound on Bush Creek, which you see to the top right, contemporary. One of the most common Hopewell exports to Ontario are Panpipe Bands, and you can see an example in the center there. And I've always been intrigued because it's obvious that there were panpipes being produced. And I've always wondered what kind of music was being played. You know, I don't expect it's like modern Peruvian, but it's very intriguing. And it's too bad that that particular item, that musical instrument, didn't continue on into the historic period. But there it was 2,000 years ago. Anyway, the thing is that also in that vicinity of Rice Lake, it's perhaps no surprise to find these panpipe covers in the Trent Valley associated with native silver nuggets from cobalt. And it's obvious that the Trent Valley, Rice Lake, was on the trade network with Ohio. So during subsequent millennia, from about 2,000 to 1,000 years ago, potters adopted new vessel forms and ceramic production technologies. And it's during this period that modern archaeochemistry has provided a window on long-distance contacts and influences. Residue contained in this vessel, recovered from a depth of 90 feet in Lake Ontario by a Kingston diver, provided evidence for the presence of caffeine, of all things. Now, caffeine is a rare chemical in Native American plants. It's only available from two kinds of plants. One is cacao, which was exported from the Amazon to the Maya of Mesoamerica. Seemed kind of a long stretch in terms of connections, but it's also found in Yopon. And as you can see, it grows in the southern US. And as historically documented to the top right in the 16th century, it was used in a potion called black drink along with other plants. And it's been documented in residues from the city of Cahokia in southern Illinois, which existed from about 1,000 years ago onward, and well, for several centuries. And that was an amazing center of population. Cahokia spanned about 16 square kilometers, was larger than the city of London at 1000 AD, and contained upwards of 20,000 people in its population. But interestingly, our local folks here in the Lake Ontario drainage had the use of this particular plant, exotic plant, before the folks in the big city. So about 1,000 years ago, populations occupying the Carolinian Biotic province to the west in Ontario began to form agriculturally based villages. And here you see a very early form of village from Brantford. As you can see, dates about 1,000 years ago, palisade around a series of small houses of various forms. So about 500 to 600 years ago, substantial villages were established in Prince Edward County, perhaps including migrant Iroquois populations from Jefferson County to the south, but none have been documented in Hastings County to the north. Here's just a map of the distribution of 16th and 17th century sites. The Benson and Trent Foster sites to the east are Huron-Wendat sites, probably with fairly substantial Anishinaabe populations. Also, the group of the cluster down on the northern St. Lawrence are a series of peoples that migrated from Jefferson County down the St. Lawrence across the river and became known as the St. Lawrence Iroquois. They're the same people that Cartier met at Montreal, at Hochelaga in the 16th century. So, this is the names that we have in general. Some of the locations that you see here for different groups documented by the early French are better than others, let's say. And the Arendarrhonons over to the east are the Rock Nation of the Huron-Wendat, who were initially living in the Kawarthas area and moved north into Wendake about 1590. But all these other groups are Anishinaabe bands, with the exception of the Ononchatarronons, who are kind of a mix, it would seem, based on the limited historical documentation we have. They seem to have consisted of chiefs who spoke Iroquois language and other ones who spoke Algonquin. And it may be that they are sort of an amalgam of St. Lawrence Iroquois who had disappeared from the St. Lawrence River Valley by the time Champlain arrived, and local Algonquin bands. So it's just part of the tremendous complexity that was represented in the historical and archaeological record. Here's one of my favorite maps. It's on deer hide parchment, dates to about 1641, as you see. It was constructed probably by Jean Bourdon, an engineer, French engineer. It was intended, it would seem, to explain the political situation in the lower Great Lakes to the French court. It went over, and so they've written a lot of information on it, but generally speaking, they show where the Algonquins are located. In the yellow, they show the island of Iroquois speakers in Ontario. And then to the south, in the red area, we have the bad guys, the Iroquois and the Fire Nation, with whom the Ontario Iroquoian groups were warring. So it just basically showed what the political situation was at that time. This map was actually stolen by the British forces during the fall of Quebec in the 18th century, ended up in the Admiralty archives in Britain, and was only discovered about 40 or 50 years ago. But it's wonderful because it's the earliest depiction of various tribal locations in the Northeast. It really has been helpful. And here are a series of so-called Iroquois de Nord sites around 1660 in your region, and villages and campsites, and of course, Fort Frontenac, which was established a little bit later. And the reason that I've put Cayuga in parentheses is that it refers to the fact that the people who identified the Iroquois de Nord, the Seneca, Cayuga, and one small village of Oneida, north of Lake Ontario during the latter half of the 17th century, were not all Iroquois in the sense of being born and raised in upstate New York. Here's a quote from one of the Jesuits. Father Jerome Lallemont, as you can see in his relation of 1659-60. I'll give you a minute to read it. It just shows the success of the Five Nations in recruiting members of the other nations, adopting them, bringing them into their nations. It's an amazing statement, I think. And this is not, we're not talking here about just Iroquoian speakers like the Erie and Neutral or the Piton or Tobacco Nation. We're also talking about Central Algonquin nations like the Fire Nations, who would be the Kickapoo, the Sauk, the Fox, the Mascoutin. And so it's amazing, an amalgam of peoples. So let's look at the quickly at the history of the archaeology in the region. So here's a report by Thomas Walbridge in 1860. And it's the earliest published report that I've been able to find. Thomas was born in Belleville. He was a lawyer who represented North Hastings in the Legislative Assembly of the Province of Canada from 1863 to 1866. And he was reporting on a series of mounds along the Bay of Quinte. David Brule was our first provincial archaeologist, started publishing annual archaeological reports, as you can see in the center there, starting 1887 and right through to the period of his death in the early 20th century. So he was a very influential individual and did a lot to promote archaeology and archaeological conservation. I know you can't probably read the letter to the right, but it's from someone in Belleville who wanted to report the mounds that Walbridge had earlier published on in the Quinte area and suggested to David that perhaps he should take a look in the area. And David did travel into Hastings County, certainly. Actually, he traveled in the early days, early 1890s with Chamberlain, who was a very good ethnographer. And there's an article by Chamberlain there. The Algonquin Indians of Baptiste Lake provides some linguistic information, information concerning the building of Birchbark canoes, etc. And you'll see in the top left, one of Boyle's reports of being in Herschel Township, so-called at the time, going to Baptiste Lake, among other places, and also Lake Westland-Coon, and on the perimeter of the county. My favorite part about the latter is he says most of the county of the Lake Westland-Coon area is impossible of cultivation, and the roads are consequently like those of the Scottish Highlands. Of course, David being of Scottish heritage, before their improvement was undertaken by Cromwell's military representative, reminding one of what a local poet said about them. Had you seen these roads before they were made, you'd have said, God bless General Wade. He talks about roads over hills that are frightfully steep, over rocks, acres in extent, across corduroy bridges and swampaducts. I can only guess what those were. Hopefully, Public Works has improved the road since. So some of the material that was collected from Baptiste Lake just north of Bancroft included these lovely ceramic vessels dating 1620 to 30, European metal goods that were being utilized by the Indigenous communities. The brass kettles being shown because the arrow point to the right has been cut from a brass kettle. So it seems a lot of times Indigenous communities may or may not have utilized European goods for the purposes the Europeans expected, but often used them for raw material. They well knew about copper, obviously, by this time. So they made a variety of other tools that were more useful to them. Here's a series of what we call vasiform style stone pipes from Baptiste Lake again. You'll hear more about them shortly. So here's a major person in the history of archaeology in Hastings and Prince Edward counties. It's George Chad. And he acquired a large and diverse collection of archaeological and natural history specimens between roughly 1850 and his death in 1917. He displayed them at Weller's Bay during the mid-1880s and 90s, and then in Trenton, which he moved to subsequently from 1901 to 1917. And I would like to point out that there's a really excellent article on Chad that's been written and submitted for publication by David Harris. And you should keep an eye out for that. I believe it's being published by the Ontario Archaeological Society in their journal. So it was such a big collection that Roland Orr, who took over from David Boyle subsequently at the museum, Provincial Museum, basically begged the province to acquire it. And you see a bit of his letter to the Minister of Education concerning the collection and its acquisition, and was extremely grateful that the province actually did spend the money to acquire it. And there's a little bit of the inventory of Chad's collection here in the annual archaeological report to the left, and some images to the right. You'll see the birdstones from about 3,000 years ago, top left, Iroquois style ceramic pipes, top right, combs to the far right, stone pipes, bottom left, ceramics in the center. And so it was just an incredibly important, huge collection. And thank God it ended up in the ROM now. So subsequent to this period with David Boyle's work up to about 1911, we have 20th century archaeology involving Winterberg, who was the first federal archaeologist at the Victoria Memorial Museum in Ottawa, who was there between 1911 and 1941 when he passed away, unfortunately. And he did some local inspections of find spots reported by the public in Hastings County. And he was a protege of Boyle's, and prior to his employment by the museum in Ottawa. He also worked all across Canada, being a federal archaeologist. Russell Barber, in 1975, undertook a survey in the southern area of the county, registering 16 sites ranging from Middle Archaic through Middle Woodland, and registering them in the provincial database. And Hugh Dexel's 1984 survey of the Moira River watershed identified an additional 17 sites spanning the late Archaic to late Woodland periods. And since then, there have been a number of small-scale surveys associated with land development activities, things like pipelines, mine remediation, wastewater treatment plants, et cetera, by licensed archaeological consulting firms or CRM firms. So on to history. Here we have Samuel de Champlain, an icon of Canadian history, no doubt. I'm sure we all heard about him in school. Unfortunately, we have no contemporary images of him, so all of the ones that you'll ever see are artist conceptions. And the reason I'm showing this image, which he produced in one of his reports, to the right is you'll notice how the warriors, the Iroquois to the right, and the Huron-Wendat and Algonquins to the left, were clothed for this battle or not. And I'm going to be looking at some of the information that Champlain provided about local Indigenous people. And my question has always been, reading these texts, Champlain actually revised his reports several times between 1619 and 1632. And you have to wonder how politically savvy he was concerning the complex indigenous world around him. In fact, one of the things that I've always wondered about is why the local Indigenous people of the Ottawa Valley, St. Lawrence, southeastern Ontario, never told him about a route to Wendake or Huronia that was 250 kilometers shorter than the one via Lake Nipissing. So here's his report on a group, as you can see, called the Chevaux Relevés, or high hairs. So what he says is that he meets 300 men, and you can see a picture from his report here to the left. They're armed, naked, painted, and coiffed for combat. There are no women, children, or elderly in the group. So if you figure that Champlain's assessment of the assembled numbers is not an exaggeration, then it would have required the congregation of all the young men from all the Anishinaabeg bands surrounding Georgian Bay, plus those across the north shore of Lake Huron, given an average band population of 50 persons. So it's suggestive that in February of 1616, when he snowshoed from Wendake west to the Blue Mountains, that he met in February of 1616 an Adawa village in the Blue Mountains, where some of the people from this gathering at the mouth of the French River were living. In fact, they gave them a feast and a good time, according to Champlain. So when Champlain asked what they were doing at the mouth of the French River, the chief of the gathering indicated that they were picking blueberries. So you kind of got to wonder, what was the objective of the Indigenous substantial gathering? Was it there to impress him or to assess him? Or could there even have been an optional darker motive? Because in 1637, an Adawa delegation visited the Jesuits at Ste. Marie to return 2,400 glass beads stolen from Brule many years before. Basically, they had rolled Brule and taken his trade goods. And so Brule had been through there previous to Champlain, and I guess they were also considering what they might do to him. But interesting thing is that when the Adawa arrived for a second time at Ste. Marie with the beads, they were asking the Jesuits to take away the epidemic that was decimating their community. And of course, the Jesuits, rather than accept the 2,400 beads in payment, pointed skyward and said, to pray. So here's a map that was published by Champlain of the Great Lakes region, which was based on the Adawa Chiefs Map, which the chief had kindly sketched on birchbark with charcoal. So it gives you a sense of the knowledge of the local communities in the eastern Georgian Bay area. And it's pretty extensive. So here we are, Etienne Brule. And I'll give you a few minutes to just read through this, because it's not the sort of information that we tend to have heard in school about this adventurous coureur de bois, proto-coureur de bois, and his travels. And, he might have been not the best individual in terms of personal morals, etc. But there he was, running around the countryside. Well, recent historical documentation has clearly indicated that he was a successful businessman, to say the least. Brule was taken into the upcountry, into the Huron-Wendat region by Iroquois, who I believe was a partner with Brule in the trade. Iroquois was not a major player from a French standpoint, but I think he was from an Indigenous standpoint. Certainly, Brule was hated and defamed by Champlain and French religious authorities after his alliance with the English Kirke brothers after the first fall of Quebec in 1629 during the 30 Years' War. The brothers had blockaded the St. Lawrence and had been motivated in this attack on the colony of New France by the Huguenot traders who were competitors in France. with 100 associates who were supporting Champlain. So anyway, there's no doubt that Brule was far wealthier than Champlain. He actually owned 2 houses in France and was a respected local businessman, as documented in legal records there. And as you can see, he had enough money that he was loaning money to local individuals, even including members of the French court. So basically, you see the story. He ended up murdered. It was rumored initially when the Jesuits returned to New France in 1634 that he'd been killed because he was immoral and just kind of a bad type. But in truth, Brebeuf found out that he was killed because of his relations with the Seneca Iroquois and the fact that he wanted to extend the trade directly to them, which was not on the cards, or not in the cards from a Huron-Wendat standpoint. So he may have been buried in the Ossassane ossuary in the Big Feast of the Dead in 1636. And as you can see, these are quotes by Father Lejeune in 1636 about him. Infamous wretch, scandalous, a bad impression of the morals of the French, etc. So that was Brule. This is my idea of what Iroquois might have looked like. I mean, we've got as much right to look at him as Iroquois as we do of the previous illustration of Brule, who also was never painted or recorded artistically in the 17th century. So we were faced with limited European historical records because Iroquois was Indigenous. And so we must approach his story through archaeology and even modern linguistics. Interesting, linguist John Steckley has stated that Iroquois' name is neither Huron-Wendat nor Algonquin, but that the R in his name may reflect a St. Lawrence Iroquois origin. And, based on that, I would suggest that it's possible that his family may have been among the Hochelaga refugees who joined the Huron-Wendat Rock Nation in the Kawarthas shortly after 1540. And in the 1640s, the Jesuits recorded that Iroquois nation elders told the French that they used to inhabit the island of Montreal, which would support this. The Irendaron, a rock tribe, moved north into Wendake some 50 years later. Some may have occupied the Ball village, the predecessor of the paired villages of Cahiagwe, occupied by Iroquois people and the Rock Nation, Huron, Wendat, when Iroquois wintered during Champlain's 1615 visit. And that's where Champlain was living at the time too. So the interesting thing about the circa 1600 Ball village preceding Cahiagwe, as it's been shown that it contains evidence for a greater range of trade goods, brass kettles, for instance, than any other site in Ontario or Quebec. So the occupants of that particular village were major players in the St. Lawrence trade with Europeans. In 1610, Champlain prefers to deal with Iroquois rather than the Huron-Wendat chief, Ochastaguen, in arranging the exchange of youths. So Brule went with Iroquois, and Savignon, a Huron-Wendat, went with Champlain back to France. Later, in 1615, in reference to the war party assembled for the attack on the Iroquois, Champlain refers to Iroquois as a captain. Champlain notes Iroquois' influence on the Nipissings. I kind of laugh at this, to delay his or Champlain's visit north. What he did was he provided some important wampum to the Nipissings to say, forget about that trip north with Champlain. So anyway, that was the end of Champlain's desire to head north and find James Bay. So in 1616, Iroquois was wounded at Cahiagwe during an attack by Tignawantan, or Bear Nation Huron-Wendat assassins. So it's a kind of an interesting story about that, because the Huron Nation gifted an Iroquois prisoner to Iroquois, and he was supposed to basically torture and kill this individual. But Iroquois decided not to, and in fact adopted this Iroquois as his son. Based on later information in this story, I wonder whether he was a Seneca Iroquois. But at any rate, unfortunately, from the Bear tribe perspective, Iroquois didn't torture him. He adopted him, so that they sent somebody from the Bear Nation to the village and murdered the Iroquois. And then Iroquois murdered the murderer. So all hell broke loose, and eventually they got it straightened out. But it was there was a very large, serious attempt to kill him. That is Iroquois. So it was, I think, clearly part of an intertribal struggle to assert ownership over the French trade. And in fact, the Bear Nation assumed control of the French trade from the weaker Rock Nation shortly after this incident. And Brule chose to reside in a bear village called Tawanche. So there are no further references to Iroquois by Champlain. There's a final historical reference by Recollet Friar among the neutral in the Hamilton-Brantford area in 1626-7. So Dayan reports that Iroquois is, quotes, a savage well known in those parts, neutral country that is, who had come there with 20 of his people to hunt beaver, and had killed quite 500 of them. Then when he questioned Iroquois about a shorter route from the neutral country to Montreal for trade, quotes, he would never give us any indication by which to find out the mouth of the river. So basically, Iroquois remained determined to limit French knowledge of geography, which could compromise his control of trade. There's no reference to him in the Jesuit records following the return to Wendake in 1634. Perhaps he was assassinated with his protege in 1632 to terminate his trade with the neutral and by extension the Seneca, thereby establishing complete control of the French trade in the hands of the Bear Nation. There's no record from the French, but then he was Indigenous and not a great supporter of them. If so, the Huron-Wendat were not worried about French repercussions as they were for a brief time concerning Brule's murder. And this was documented in the Jesuit relations. So a fellow archaeologist asked me how Iroquois, a non-neutral Iroquoian, could enter their territory and harvest 500 beaver in a season. So I'm going to suggest that perhaps archaeology and ethnology can provide a possible answer. These are the Baptiste Lake bassiform pipes made of soapstone or steatite, which I spoke to earlier. These are similar specimens from 17th century neutral sites. And these pipes in style and form are the very ones that later in the 18th century were connected with Calamet ceremonies between tribes and individuals, as documented by the French in the Midwest. It was a diplomatic ceremony and in fact was adopted by the French for that particular purpose in meeting new groups. So it was a powerful, powerful ceremonial event. So here you see Lafitaux's image of a Calamet ceremony in the 18th century. So what it is basically the creation of an alliance with differing groups through the concept of fictive kinship. You are now related to me. You are now a member of our community. And this is what the archaeology has told us. You have the Baptiste Lake site up here in Algonquin site. You have a series of geological sources of steatite or soapstone over here in the Shield area. You have only 2 of these pipes from the whole Huron-Wendat, hundreds of villages up here. There's none from the Piton villages over by Blue Mountain. And in the neutral, there are quite a number of specimens. So I'll just suggest that they actually were a calling card, a gift, a representation of a Calamet ceremony like adoption ceremony between Iroquois and the neutral with whom he obviously had a substantial trade interest. So, and that's about all I have to say, although I do like to conclude with a bit of a little bit of humor. So I'll just flip to the next slide there. Okay. Also, I'll move up to what I was going to show while people were waiting to be lit in. It gives you a little bit of a background. And I'd be happy to take any questions people might have.
So if anybody does have questions, we're going to use the chat function of Zoom. So if you want to ask any questions of Bill Fox, I ask you to use the chat, please, and I'll read the questions. And that'd be the simplest way. This way we can continue to have Bill's bio screen up on the Zoom screen. One thing I was curious to know, what do they smoke in those clay pipes?
Well, we know that they had tobacco for quite a long time. In fact, some of the more recent information we've had, see, tobacco seeds are extremely tiny, so it takes very careful recovery from archaeological sites to recover them. So you get carbonized tobacco seeds, and they're around for over 1,000 years in southern Ontario. But it looks like it's possible that the tobacco was being grown and utilized 3,000 years ago in Ontario and earlier elsewhere based on recent information. So yeah, that's one thing they smoked in them. But there's ethnographic information concerning the use of kinnikinnick, so-called red willow bark, inner bark, being smoked by Anishinaabe groups. And there's other things, but I think tobacco was pretty important.
Okay. Well, here's a question about the recording. Vicky McCullough wants to know if the recording will be sent to participants. Vicky's working and multitasking, so not fully listening. Well, pay attention, Vicky. In fact, you may have addressed this question already. No, but I'm going to address it now. We had a little bit of a speed bump getting started. The session is being recorded, and it will be turned around and put up on the Hastings County Historical Society YouTube channel in a day or two. So you'll be able to find it there. Any other questions?
Okay. I hope I didn't put anyone to sleep.
Pardon me?
I said, I hope I didn't put anyone to sleep.
Okay, question. Okay, Vicky heard that response. All right, questions from, these are coming in quickly now. Brian, Reboletto, he lives in Picton. Where can I learn more about the village that once existed here and others throughout Prince Edward County?
Well, the information is scattered initially amongst a variety of early reports, such as the annual archaeological reports for Ontario that I mentioned. There was a study done, 30 years ago by the ROM, sort of taking a lot of Chad's data. So there's an unpublished report in the hands of the ROM concerning a wide variety of sites in Prince Edward County, but there's also individual site reports published by groups such as the National Museum concerning excavations of the Payne site, or McDonald site as it was known, a big Iroquois village in Prince Edward County. The data are all over the place, and so you kind of have to work at it. There's no definitive overall Prince Edward County archaeology synthesis.
Question from Anne Reedish or Reddish. Members of my Thurlow Township farming family occasionally found points
Mm.
I assume many other families did too. Could these and possibly other items become part of any semi-documented finds to add to the overall record? And can we find out the dates of them?
Certainly. I mean, that's something that I've spent decades doing, is working with the public, uh, looking at collections. And I'm not the only one. There's people like Dr. Chris Ellis over at Western University, and many others. The Ontario Archaeological Society provides some identification services also. So people are out there. I think maybe the easiest thing to do would be to contact the Ontario Archaeological Society, indicate that you'd seen this talk, and would it be possible to have some material identified? A lot of, well, you, it's hard to even imagine the volume of Indigenous artifacts that were exposed when the land was first broken in Southern Ontario. And it's, especially when they're following a horse plowing, you're a lot closer to the ground. And so, I refer to a lot of these farm collections as 6-quart basket collections. The big stuff, like the big groundstone adzes, of course, were taken out pretty rapidly. Some of the 17th century sites actually provided raw material. Like there were so many French iron trade axes off some farms where there were major villages that they took them down to the blacksmith to turn them into something useful. So anyway, there's a tremendous amount of information out there. Every time that the archaeological community gets a chance to, someone's showing me, and Reddish showing me a big triangular point that looks like it dates to about 1,200 years ago, somewhere in that ballpark, maybe a bit later, 1100 AD. Yep. Suggests that there might be a so-called late woodland or late middle woodland camp on your property, if that's where it's from, at your property, that is. So, and I'd be happy to have a look at material. If you want to send an image, I'll give you a sense of the time range represented. But there were hundreds of thousands of pieces exposed by the farming.
Just before we get into questions, a couple of people have asked about the YouTube channel. Which YouTube? Hastings County Historical Society. The simplest thing is to search for Hastings County Historical Society. You'll find the icon of the logo, click on that, and then look for videos on the list, and you'll see this one and other presentations that we've had. I'll try and type in the address in the chat. However, I'm busy answering questions right now, or forwarding questions. Here's one from Francois Castillou. Do you think the destruction of Huronia had an impact on the First Nations of Hastings County?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that Hastings County and Prince Edward County, and in that general area down the St. Lawrence, became a no man's land, so to speak, from about, 1620 through to 1650, because of Iroquois incursions. It just wasn't safe for any of the locals to be traveling through that particular area, let alone living there. So the Iroquois, supported by the Dutch with firearms, really basically terminated the Ontario Iroquois occupation, 1649, 50, 51.
Question from Shirley Sutherland. Do you have any information about the archaeological dig done on the south shore of Stokoe Lake on Rush Lane in the early 60s?
I don't, but Stokoe Lake was certainly mentioned in the archaeological reports by Hugh Dexel and the other gentleman. I'm just trying to look through here. Actually, it's funny. Just give me a second, please. Oh, it's Russell Barber. Yeah, I actually contacted Russell Barber, who did the 1975 survey in Hastings County. And I found him a professor out in California. And he said that that work in Hastings County was basically his first and last in Ontario. But anyway, so at least we've got some information from his report. But Stokoe Lake, yes, definitely. There's quite a lot of evidence, archaeological evidence in that area.
Armand Labarge wants to know if about a story told of a great battle near present-day Tweed and Stokoe Lake involving a Mississauga chief by the name of Chief Stoukong, Stoukong, who apparently defeated a Mohawk chief in a single combat on September 30th, 1698. Has any archaeological evidence of that battle been discovered?
I think the chances of documenting that battle are pretty slight, but it's really interesting oral history, that's for darn sure. And it's at a time when the Mississauga are, it's interesting, like the term Mississauga originally comes from the Mississauga River, where there was an Anishinaabe band resident for thousands of years, along over towards Sault Ste. Marie on the North Shore. In addition to those Mississauga, there was the Crane people in the Sioux. There was the Amiquois or Beaver people to the east. There was the Catfish people down around Parry Sound. So there are a whole bunch of different Anishinaabe bands. And, the Mississauga, so to speak, were in the 17th century, early 17th century, but one of them. Anyway, there was a huge movement of Anishinaabe of various, affiliations heading south into southern Ontario from about 1670 onwards, basically. And so there are plenty of battles documented through oral histories by Anishinaabe communities. In fact, they're pretty startling. And things, they were definitely happening, like the Battle of Blue Mountain around Craigleith in the South Shore of Georgian Bay. So yeah, all I can say is, I quite believe that there would have been a battle there. Not surprising. The Mississauga Anishinaabe were moving south. The Iroquois vacated the area along the North Shore of Lake Ontario just shortly after 1670. But they were still hunting and trapping through there subsequently, but they were bumping heads for sure with the Mississauga.
For those who are wondering about the video of this Zoom presentation, Sarah McCabe has posted the link in the chat box, so you can just click on that and that'll take you right to our YouTube channel and the videos. So thank you, Sarah, for being my assistant on this journey. Question from Francois again. Was there any large population of First Nations in Hastings County pre- and post-Confederation?
Pre- and post-Confederation. Well, as I tried to indicate, the Hastings County, bless its heart, wasn't exactly cut out climatically or soil-wise for the growing of corn. So there's no sort of large villages documented in the region. It was, relatively sparsely populated by Southwestern Ontario standards or upstate New York standards. So the, Anishinaabe communities, the bands living along the rivers like the Moira or around the lakes like Baptiste Lake were light on the land. So it's not easy to get a very clear picture of exactly how many people were living there at a specific time. I'm not trying to dodge the question. I'm just indicating that, pre-Confederation, there would have been, I expect, there would have been populations that were pretty comparable to post-Confederation in terms of size. Certainly, Chamberlain's article is very interesting about the group living at Baptiste Lake, and it's a small Algonquin band. And there's some really interesting stuff in that article. You really should check it out, about traditional stories of battles with the Mohawk. And there was even reputedly the Anishinaabe community living on an island in Baptiste Lake in the late 19th century, at the same time as there was a Mohawk village on the lake too, which really, raises some interesting questions about relationships. Maybe those were the Mohawk who moved north to the east side of Georgian Bay. I don't know, or perhaps down to the reserves to the south.
We have warm greetings from the Ontario Historical Society from Sarah McCabe. Thank you, Sarah. Mary Cannon, I'm a Baptiste Lake Algonquin descendant.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to actually have the opportunity to communicate with that particular band. I guess it's not an official quotes band under the Indian Act, but yeah, I'd really like to know what their history is, stretching back into the early 17th century. I know that the group on Baptiste Lake came from the Montreal area at some time in the probably late 17th century, 18th century. But before that, it'd be great if there was any traditional knowledge about their whereabouts. Anyway.
Do you want to get in touch with Mary? Mary, do you want to chat with Bill? Maybe I could send you email addresses, or...
That would be a good idea if you would.
Yeah, if that's okay with you, Mary, I'll forward on your email address to Bill. Question from Francois again. Last question. Smiley face. I don't believe that, but where can we find this report about Baptiste Lake?
It's in the annual Archaeological Report for Ontario. It's near the back of the issue. I believe it's the 1890 issue of the annual report. And it's Chamberlain who is the author.
Great. One thing I noticed in your presentation, you had some images of the Baptiste Lake ceramic, I guess they're pots. And yeah, actually they were similar to one that was found at Sandbanks Provincial Park and was in their visitor center. I'm not sure if they still have a visitor center, but it was on display there for many years.
Yeah, I did some work down there. And in fact, one of the, I'd say yes, it could be, although most of the material that's come out of Sandbanks is earlier. Okay. But anyway, that was, I guess, my introduction to Tyananaga, because went down there as usual as unmarked grave investigator for the province to deal with some accidentally exposed human remains. And of course, they were Indigenous. Well, I shouldn't say of course, because I dealt with as many Euro-Canadian graves as Indigenous ones. But anyway, so I had an osteologist do an analysis and then asked band council if I could make a presentation with the osteologist to Tyananaga. And we went down to the reserve, must have been 40 years ago or so, 30, 40 years ago. And we made a presentation to the community about what we had learned from the study. And the interesting thing was that it turned out to be extremely positive meeting, because it drifted into issues of community health and things that are more salient, let's say, to the community nowadays than what might have been happening in the Sandbanks area 1,500 years ago. So it turned out, I thought, into a really productive dialogue. Anyway, so much for that.
Francois says, "You're awesome, Bill. Thank you."
Well, that's more than generous.
Anybody else have any questions? Oh, here's one. Great presentation. Love the slides, and I loved your passion. That's from Armand Labarge.
Yeah, well, pretty precocious little kid. Probably a bit of a, well, definitely a nerd, but anyway.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Just as well.
Okay. All right. Godfrey Frank, there's an interesting study done around 1995 called A Historical Geography of the Mississauga Presence in Southeastern Ontario, Pre-Loyalist Historical Geography, OS Southeastern Ontario, by Dr. Brian Osborne of Queen's University and Dr. Michael Ripmeister of Brock University.
Right. Yeah, there's been some excellent work done by historians studying records from the, well, basically the 18th through the 19th centuries. And there was work done on the Saugeen Nation to the west. And there's just a whole series of very good analyses, if you will, of the historical records. One of the things I really like to do is to really consider the earlier records, 16th, 17th century, early 17th century, and try to find out what was really happening and what the European recorders were actually seeing, because I'm quite convinced that they didn't see a lot of what was going on around them.
Fascinating work, archaeology. I mean, you're basically trying to recreate the past for us here in the present, based on few artifacts.
Yeah, it's in order to do that, one really needs to have seen a great deal. So, you put together the most cogent story that you can, given the huge array of data out there, and how that specific pieces that you're putting together fit the larger picture. And yeah, it's amazing the things that you see. I've been so honored to see so much in my career, just outstanding. And I'm still working on my backlog of reports from the days when I worked for the province, and they gave us enough money to go out and rescue sites, living in campgrounds and taking corn from local farm fields. But anyway, so much for that.
Where does oral history fit into your work?
Well, it hasn't always fit into the academic community's work. And in fact, there's been a lot of discussion concerning its validity, whether or not to use it. It's even been, entered into court cases where the Indigenous communities are arguing for rights and compensation under legislation from the 19th and 20th centuries. So, it can be highly contentious. But personally, I tend to see that there's a lot of really important leads in those stories. And some of these stories go back a considerable time. Amongst the Anishinaabe of Lake Huron, Bruce Peninsula area, for instance, there are stories about culture heroes being involved in trying to chase down giant beavers who were impacting the geography. And, there were giant beavers, 12,000 years ago, and there were much higher water levels in the Great Lakes at that time. And, you just have to basically keep an open mind and, work together. Hopefully there's positive results for the Indigenous communities.
Any more questions? Armand Labarge, there's a lot of controversy today, and rightfully so, about Indigenous artifacts being removed from Indigenous burial sites and kept in various museums and private collections. What are your thoughts on that?
That's, up front, totally agree. It was common practice for grave sites to be disturbed throughout the 19th century, even the late 18th century. In fact, there was a piece of provincial legislation that was passed, I think, in the 1790s, forbidding disturbance of Mississauga graves by Euro-Canadian settlers. But there's another side to this question, though, and that is the tremendous amount of information about the past that's held by the material that's housed in these institutions. I routinely work at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, while actually in Suitland, Maryland is where their curatorial facility is, studying collections that were purchased by a big time collector in the States back in the early 20th century. Some of that material probably came from burial sites, but then again, if we didn't have it, we would lose so much of our understanding of what's going on at these various periods of time. So, it's a really thorny issue. It's straightforward, I think, from an Indigenous standpoint. It shouldn't have happened, and the material probably shouldn't be there. I like to look at, when I was over working at a Winnipeg, there was a curator of the Manitoba Museum called Catherine Pettipas back in the 90s. And she had an agreement with some of the Plains elders, various tribes, Cree and Assiniboine, and the museum held sacred bundles. And the agreement she came to with the elders was that annually they would come to Winnipeg at the museum's expense and basically handle and smudge these bundles that were kept away from the public and to care for them, but that they didn't want them destroyed. And frankly, in the States, there have been some curators who have taken these kind of bundles and burned them. Again, it just hurts a person like myself who wants to learn. And again, maybe it's not for me to learn, I don't know, but it's just I think there are some potential compromises in terms of options. And sometimes when I was actually asked by the Western Cherokee of Oklahoma they heard that I've been studying box turtle shell rattles, which are an important part of women's ceremonies in southeastern communities like the Creek and the Cherokee and others. And they were in the process of revitalizing women's ceremonies in Oklahoma. So they asked me to provide information concerning these box turtle shell rattles. I basically studied every archaeological and ethnological sample from east of the Mississippi. And so I had a huge database, but I was missing a chunk of the story that didn't allow me to connect the archaeological specimens with the 18th and 19th century ethnological specimens. And the reason that gap was there in the 17th century was because under NAGPRA, early days, the remains from a particular site in North Carolina had been reburied without proper documentation. So there I was. I said, I'm really sorry. I know I can tell you about the 18th, 19th century. I can tell you about, 5,000 years of use prior to 1600, but I can't connect the two to give you, the proper story about how this how these particular items were utilized. So, you know, that's an example where good intentions were destructive and were not helpful to the Indigenous communities. So it's, again, it's a very, very complex issue. And it has to be resolved through consultation between Indigenous communities and these institutions.
Question from Anne. Do you know about the U of Calgary Cluny site, C-L-U-N-Y?
Yep.
Any update about what they decided that site was? She was there a few years ago.
I don't know about updates because I was never directly involved with Alberta sites, but so far as I understand, the story hasn't changed a lot in it being sort of a major trade site that was established by one of the Plains tribes. I guess it was Blackfoot, I guess. I'm not sure. I think it was. Anyway, yeah, I sort of plunked into territories claimed by a variety of Plains tribes. It was fortified, as you know, and I don't know what else to tell you, but I've certainly, a long time ago, I read quite a bit about it, and I haven't heard anything about Cluny since, to be quite honest.
Brian wants to know, do we know the specific locations of any of the burial mounds along the northern shores of Prince Edward County? There are said to be over 100. Have
Right.
none been protected?
Yes, I have never been there. I couldn't tell you. The letter that I showed in my one slide in the PowerPoint presentation that was sent in 1901 talks about some at Massasauga Point, which is also an area that was identified by the earlier report. There has been some research fairly recently by an archaeologist looking into them, at least some of them. A fair number of these mounds apparently do not include human remains, may not be related to burial activities per se. And I think, now that I come to think of it, that there's actually a report on this in the Ontario Archaeological Society journal, maybe 10 years ago. I'd have to look, and yeah, it talks about them. You want to contact me, I can check it out and tell you who the archaeologist was who did the study, and I believe he's in the Toronto area. So.
Questions. Or forever hold your peace.
Well, I think everybody's probably a bit tired.
I think so. It's been a long session, very informative, great session. Jim, I think what I'm going to do is stop our screen share now, and
Bill, on behalf of the Hastings County Historical Society, I want to thank you for your presentation on the early Indigenous populations and their evidence over the course of centuries and the more recent evidence. It was very fascinating, and I could have listened to it for a lot longer. And we have a better understanding of what happened before written history began in this area. And I found the time period with relations with Quebec just is equally interesting. We'd like to thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
Oh, thank you very much.
I just want to remind people too that our next presentation in November 24th is going to be by Christopher Ruddy, and he's going to be talking about Dr. Collop, a co-discoverer of insulin. It promises to be a very interesting and informative session. And I think he's one of those unsung heroes in the medical community in Canada that hasn't really got the credit until now that he so deservedly should have. So please join us next November 24th at 3 o'clock, and that'll be done in conjunction with the Belleville Public Library. And once again, thank you, Bill.
Yep, you're welcome, and have a good day.